I don't want the message to be that if you have a family history, you're going to be an addict. In order to prevent it, right, we need to look at some of these potential causes or things that make you more likely to have an addiction. We really have to keep all of these things in mind when really trying to prevent. When we look at risk factors for addiction in general, or even opioid addiction, we always break it down into the biological factors. Because we certainly know now neuroscientifically that there are certain brains that have more of an affinity, I should say, for opiates and more of a likelihood of addiction. So we're going to break it down by biology. And when we're under that biology heading, we're going to say genetics. So if you have a first-degree relative that has an addiction, you're talking 8 times more likely that you can potentially have an addiction. So if it's in the family, that raises your risk. Usually first-degree relatives are going to really raise the risk, okay?
In your related family?
In your biological family.
Okay.
Your first-degree relative,
So
mom, dad, brother, sister.
It's coming from an actual DNA genetic standpoint. It's not that, my stepdad was an addict, I saw that, and now I'm an addict.
Great point. Because that also contributes, but that contributes in an environmental way. So we're looking at the biology and we're saying there's a genetic component here. So if your dad was a heroin addict and the minute you were born, I put you with a different family, you have an 8 times more likelihood of becoming an addict than if your father was not a heroin addict, right? However, let's take that another step and we'll talk about environmental factors. If you have a parent that abuses anything or has an addictive substance dependence, you're more likely to use just based on that environmental circumstance. So if household members, if your siblings use, if family members use, it puts you at a higher risk, right? So now we're getting into the social aspect of things. When we see risk factors, we also see that children, even at a young age, that have impulse control disorders, that have untreated mental health disorders, right? So bipolar disorder, severe depression, severe anxiety, are more at risk for developing an addiction, probably because they're going to self-medicate to alleviate some of those symptoms. So untreated behavioral health problems, family members that use, impulse control disorders, untreated ADHD type stuff is puts you at a higher risk bracket. Then, of course, we talk about the social stuff like children that are abused, for example, have a higher likelihood of using substances down the line. Certain personality disorder types have a higher likelihood of abusing substances. And then we talked about a lower socioeconomic demographic puts you in a higher risk, sort of stratification. And the funny thing is we just go opposite now. We can flip that. And we could say, what are the protective factors when we look at people that don't use, right? And socially, and to me, these are the things that we can change. What we can change. Good child-parent relationships is a protective factor, right?
And just to clarify, protective factors are things that we see are correlated to non-use, non-addiction.
To less use, to non-addiction. So literally having a better relationship, a better family relationship is a protective factor. Being more involved in your child's life, having your child be more involved in the community is a protective factor, right? It's very interesting stuff. Schools and families that have very strong anti-drug ideals and policies is a protective factor. Parents that have limits and consequences and structure is a protective factor. We're talking about children now growing up in the home. So all of these environmental things, I think it's important for parents to hear because these are things we can change. We have control over this. It's not genetics. And even more so, just because you have the genetic trait does not mean that you're going to be an addict, right? So you may be able to sort of hold back the tide by changing some of the environmental stuff. If you know that, hey, this person's dad was an addict, so we need to be real careful, right? So we're going to make sure that we foster great family communication. We're going to make sure that there's awesome community involvement. We're going to keep the child busy in sports and activities. We are going to, make sure the school program is very progressive in anti-drug policies. We are going to have anti-drug policies in our home. We're going to talk about it. We're going to be communicative about it. These are all protective factors that are incredibly important.
You mentioned earlier that if a child has a parent who has abused drugs, they are 8 times more likely to abuse drugs in their life.
Yeah.
Even if at the moment they were born, they were put in with a different family.
Correct.
I don't see how that works, because what happens that they would seek out or be more susceptible to drugs?
Right. So it's what that is the theory is that person's neurological makeup has more affinity for a pleasurable reaction to an opiate. So let's just say you have a father that had a severe opioid addiction. I had a father that had no addiction whatsoever. Mm-hmm. You get a Vicodin for a toothache, I get a Vicodin for a toothache. You take that, you go, wow, whoa, I was stressed out, I feel great. Mm-hmm. This is awesome. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna take another one. Now I take one, I'm like, okay, my toothache's gone. That's it.
Yeah.
Right? So it's the mental makeup, and we're gonna talk about the neuroscience behind that.
But then should parents, if they adopt a child at birth and they know the father was a heroin addict, should they not be allowing their child to take a Vicodin for a toothache?
Well, that's a good question. I think that if you know that there is a genetic history of addiction, you just need to be extra cautious with everything that you do moving forward that has to do with a potential for addiction. Mm-hmm. Listen, as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, if I take a family history and I know, let's just say you were my patient, and I do a family history with you and you say, Doc, my dad was addicted to benzodiazepines. He was addicted to Xanax. Mm-hmm. Do you know, I'm gonna be more cautious when you tell me you're anxious to prescribe you a benzodiazepine, because I know that there's something there, right? So in the same vein, if you have a child with a family history, you gotta be more cautious. Mm-hmm. You have to be more cautious. And you have to use those environmental things to just be more involved and all that community stuff we talked about to really stack the odds in the child's favor.
Yeah, I get that, but an 8 times more likelihood seems like almost something that's inevitable.
It's scary. It's very, very scary. But look, let's not forget, and I don't want that to be the message. I don't want the message to be that if you have a family history, you're gonna be an addict.
Okay.
Right? Because
that's what I'm getting right now.
Right.
And that's how I'm perceiving that.
It's scary, and that's daunting. I'm just saying be more cautious.
Okay.
Be more cautious because you just have a propensity for it. And it's easier for you. It's like the path of least resistance for you to become an addict is just less. It's a little bit easier.
Yeah.
So just be cautious, be careful.
Is there behavior that people can look out for that would indicate, ooh, this might be a cause of an addiction later in life?
Yeah, so again, we're looking at, in order to prevent it, right, we need to look at some of these potential causes or things that make you more likely to have an addiction. So when we look back at childhood, we look at things like poor social skills. If a child has poor social skills or even a poor academic history, they tend, for some reason, to be more likely to develop addiction. And that's just a big can of worms why that may happen, right? But my point is, so you have poor social skills, poor academics, right, is very, very important. Impulse control disorders, a history of aggressive behavior. These things tend to be higher in people that develop addictions later on in life.
Impulse control behaviors?
Impulse control problems,
disorders?
which makes sense in a way,
well,
right?
What are those, though?
So an impulse control disorder, it was exactly that, impulse control disorder, or you can't control your temper. You can't control your response to things, right? So children that have difficulty sort of managing their behaviors. Mm-hmm. The other important thing to really think about is the social environment too, and let's not forget something that's really blatant and sort of in your face is access. If they have access to the drugs, if you're in a neighborhood with a lot of drugs, or if you're in a school system where there are a lot of drugs, the likelihood that you're gonna get hooked on these drugs is much more, right? So access. We also look at early use. The earlier that someone uses in their life, the more likely that they can develop a significant addiction down the line, right?
Yeah.
So the younger you are that you start, the more likely something bad is gonna happen down the line with addiction. So we really have to keep all of these things in mind when really trying to prevent.
What can you speak on for people who might start drinking at the age of 12? and then they start smoking pot, and then it leads to a Percocet, and then it leads to heroin. Right now, we've been having this conversation about opioids in this insular model, but the truth is that other drug use or abuse can lead to opioid addiction. So when should parents or people be looking at that type of use as a possible cause for opioid addiction?
Yeah, such a good question, because there has been so much debate in the scientific community, in the social communities, in the political communities about what's called gateway drugs, right? You've probably heard that term, right? So as an adolescent, everybody's afraid that if you smoke marijuana, the next thing you know, you're gonna be doing heroin, right? So I want to address that. That's a really, really good point, Kyle. I'm glad you brought that up. So there are people that can use certain things, and I say this cautiously, in a social way. You go out and you have a glass of wine with dinner. Or now in California, marijuana is legal. Maybe you can have a little bit of marijuana. It helps you relax at night from time to time, right? There are individuals, though, that psychologically, based on some of these risk factors we talked about, genetic, social, environmental, that it's more likely that those, dare I use the term more benign, which they're really not, but more benign drugs will lead to a severe addiction with something more significant down the line. Those people are potentially more likely because when they smoke marijuana or when they have a glass of wine, it affects them in such a way that they go, oh God, this is just, I need this. I need more. This is making all of my problems go away. And what's happening is now psychologically, you're developing a reliance on something to make your problems go away. Okay? So if you develop just that mentality that I am so stressed out, I need X, Y, or Z tonight to just relax. And that turns into the night after, and the night after, and the night after, then you are more likely to, if you were offered another drug, because your brain says, if I take a substance, I feel better, you're more likely to probably try something else that's stronger and more different. That. Right? So you have to be so careful. And I'm not saying that people can't sometimes use recreationally safely, but again, if you have those risk factors, you better be careful. Because
it's a lot different than if you find your 16-year-old went to a high school party and got drunk on beer. Right. If they just did it because everyone else was doing it and they didn't have that reaction of, whoa, I've never felt like this is amazing, I need more of that. As opposed to the person, the 16-year-old, who goes and is like, yeah, I did that, I felt gross the next day, I don't know. Yeah,
or they could take it or leave it, or it's fun, but whatever, it's not a big deal. You know, you brought up something that's really important. Is that when we're talking about risk factors, which we are now, and prevention, transition times in people's lives is a critical, vulnerable moment, okay? So even in adolescence, divorces, moves, changes in schools, death of a loved one, life changes that are very significantly stressful. If you happen to use a substance that makes you feel better at that time when you're very vulnerable, that puts you at a higher risk. So I'm glad you said that. So as a parent, or a loved one, whoever, whether it's a spouse or a family member, whatever, if you're going through a difficult time in the family, a move, a divorce, a death, whatever, remember we talked about these things, and you start noticing that someone is relying on a substance to really get them through that, just keep an eye on that, because that tells the brain, I feel horrible, I take this, I feel better.
Right.
And then just the cycle continues.
I so get that.
Right.
I don't know if most people are watching this and going, yeah, I already knew that, but that was very clear. Yeah. I think I understood parts of that, but you just put them all together. So now I really understand. Let's keep going with the causes. What other things could be an indicator that this person might develop an addiction?
Something that's really important, we touched on this a little bit, is how the drug is taken, right? Because we talked about the delivery method of the drug and how fast it gets to your brain is how potent and how strong it is and how hard it hits you. So, for example, if someone is using a substance via injection, which is pretty much going directly to the brain, you have a more likelihood of becoming addicted than if you were taking it as a pill, which is a slow form, right? So it sort of grades the severity. God forbid you see a loved one using something in a more severe way, right? Like inhaling it, snorting it, smoking it, injecting it. They're like tiers of use. And if you kind of climb that tier, you're much more likely to become addicted to the substance if it hits you harder and stronger and more potently in the brain. So that's a significant risk factor too, the way it's taken.
You just reminded me, you mentioned this in a previous episode about accessibility. These parents or these people who keep prescription drugs available, accessible in their medicine cabinet where anybody can grab them. If you don't have the addiction or the same love affair with that drug, you wouldn't think twice about it. You would just put it in your medicine cabinet and go, all right, it's there. It's not a temptation for me. I'm going to move on with my life. Just like I will put wine in my house and not think about it. It's just there in case somebody comes over, whatever. But if an alcoholic put wine in their house, oh my gosh, it would be so tempting. And if you have a child or someone living with you whose brain is just more susceptible to those drugs and it's sitting right there in front of their face, it's no wonder this happened.
You touched on something so important, Kyle, and that's so important. I'm so glad you brought that up. Because guess where kids start with their illicit drug use? Guess where they get it from?
Their parents.
The medicine cabinet. They get it from the medicine cabinet, right? And they do this for a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's peer pressure. Sometimes they know that there's a party going on and their friends will be like, dude, you know, does your mom have any Percocet in the cabinet? And the kid's like, what's Percocet? Oh, don't just look in the cabinet, see if you can. That's where they get it, and they bring it to parties, right? So the take-home message here to family members and parents, if you have extra opiates lying around, either lock them up or get rid of them. And most communities have medication disposal services. So where I live on the East Coast, we have the local police department has like a medication drop-off box. Literally, you can drive by the police department, no questions asked. There's a drop box, boop, throw them in there, and they get rid of it, they dispose of it.
Wow.
Sometimes pharmacies will do that for you too. But if you have extra opiates lying around, get them out of the house because that's a risk factor in and of itself. So Kyle, something else too is adolescence. The adolescent brain is kind of wired towards risk taking. It's kind of normal, right? It's part of how we grow, right? When you're an adolescent, your brain really isn't fully formed yet, especially the prefrontal cortex that we talk about so often that is involved in decision making and impulse control. It's not as mature. So the adolescent brain is more likely to take risk and experiment. And my point is, it's okay to take certain risks. But unfortunately, just being an adolescent with all of these peer pressures and things just puts you at a higher risk of getting yourself into trouble, right? So really removing all of these other things that we talked about, you really want to sort of buffer the circumstances by removing all those other risk factors, because just being an adolescent, you're probably likely, or you're more likely to just experiment with something and take risks.
Yeah. So what other things can people look at in terms of preventing drug abuse and addiction?
So listen, I think education is key, and you really want to prevent early use because like we said, the earlier someone uses, the more likelihood they're gonna have an addiction problem. So prevent that early use and the vulnerable time.
Any use.
Any use. But the vulnerable time though is adolescence and during difficult life transitions. So be especially on the lookout during those times.
That's a good place to end this conversation. I want to move into the neuroscience behind all of this because understanding those components are really going to help people. So in our next episode, Dr. Sportelli is going to explain the neuroscience for all of us. Thanks for watching. Check out the links below for more information on how to access this full series, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch new mental health videos every week. Did you like what you heard in this video? If you want to ask a MedCircle doctor a question directly, you can learn how by visiting the links in the description below.